What do you do when thousands are dying and the people in power refuse to see why? If you're Florence Nightingale, you don't just carry a lamp. You carry a data set powerful enough to confront an empire. Welcome to this four-part miniseries spotlighting women in history who used maths to solve real-world problems, transforming the fields of medicine, banking, accountancy, and economics. For Women's History Month, on Breaking Math. I'm Autumn Finef.
And I'm Dr. Victoria Bateman. Throughout time, women's contributions have often been underappreciated. Yet they've shaped policy, theory, and practice in profound ways. Here, we honour their stories, highlight their ideas, and celebrate the impact they've had on shaping our world. Let's begin. In this episode, we're talking about the extraordinary Florence Nightingale, the British statistician and social reformer who transformed modern nursing and pioneered the use of data in public health. Her work during the Crimean War reshaped how governments think about medicine, sanitation, and accountability. So, Autumn, tell me, who is she and why is she a favourite historical figure of yours?
She's hands down one of my favorite women in history. And honestly, once you know her real story, it's impossible not to be a little obsessed with her. Florence Nightingale was a 19th century British reformer born in 1820, right in the middle of the Industrial Revolution, a time where the world was modernizing fast, science was advancing, cities were booming, and empires were expanding. But medicine was still shockingly behind.
So most people, I think, would remember Florence Nightingale as the gentle lady with the lamp, the founder of modern nursing.
And yes, she absolutely transformed nursing, but her most radical contribution wasn't the lamp, and it wasn't even nursing. It was math. She used statistics and data visualization to prove soldiers weren't mostly dying from battle wounds. They were dying from preventable diseases caused by horrific hospital conditions. And she didn't just claim that, she collected the data. She structured it, analyzed it, and turned it into visual charts so powerful that government leaders literally couldn't ignore what they were seeing. That's why I admire her so much. She combined compassion and quantitative reasoning, and she showed the world that math isn't cold or abstract. It can expose injustice, change policy, and save lives. And honestly, anyone who can use numbers as a force of good for institutions to do better is kind of my hero. Now, can you elaborate for us a lot more on the historical context, specifically the Crimean War?
Right, so the Crimean War took place in the middle of the 19th century, and it was really the equivalent of the war in Ukraine today. So back then, in the 19th century, Britain was part of a coalition of European powers that went up against Russia in the area around the Black Sea in an effort to halt Russia's territorial expansion. Nightingale arrived at the British military hospital, which had been set up just away from the military action in a place called Scutari, which is in present-day Turkey. And she found conditions there so severe in the hospital that they were actually deadlier than on the battlefield. So to sum it up, wards were filthy and overcrowded. Injured soldiers were left sleeping on the floor. No one was cleaning the toilets or the chamber pots that were used in the day. And sewage contaminated drinking water. The ventilation was terrible. Food was being thrown away rather than being cooked for the patients because no one was taking charge of the cooking. And that left the injured soldiers going hungry, not very helpful for their recovery. And hygiene practices were, well, non-existent. I mean, we're talking dirty bandages and so on. So soldiers who managed to survive combat but who were injured found themselves dying soon after admission to the hospital. But officials were insisting that those deaths were inevitable rather than avoidable. And Nightingale suspected that the real cause wasn't, medical fate, but it was environmental. It was the environment in the hospital.
Quite naturally, that's kind of common sense. But she strategized by accepting these assumptions. And did that just mean she was systematically recording data? If so, exactly what was it?
So quietly, behind the scenes, there in the hospital, yes, she began recording everything, tracking the causes of death, the sanitary conditions, the degree of crowding, temperatures, ventilation, and the seasonal illness patterns. And by organizing those records that she made into structured data sets, she uncovered a striking pattern that most soldiers were dying from preventable infectious diseases like cholera, typhus, and dysentery there in the hospital, not from the wounds that they entered the hospital with from the battlefield. And in some weeks and months, disease deaths there in the hospital vastly outnumbered the deaths that were happening out on the battlefront. So, armed with statistical evidence and clear visual charts, she then presented her findings to the military leaders and government leaders, directly challenging their narrative, ultimately in an effort to save lives. And that data forced action. So sanitation reforms were introduced, hospital conditions improved, and mortality rates dropped dramatically. Nightingale had demonstrated something revolutionary for her time, that careful measurement and analysis could expose hidden systemic failures, and that once the truth was visible, reform became unavoidable. But of course, as a woman, Nightingale faced a particular challenge in achieving what she did, don't you think, Autumn?
Yes, we know this pattern by now. In the 19th century, medicine and science were overwhelmingly male dominated. Women were rarely allowed any formal kind of training, and nursing itself was considered a low status labor instead of a skilled profession. Nurses were stereotyped as drunkards or harlots. Definitely not the kind of work that middle class ladies should be doing. Alongside this, women were also excluded from decision making spaces such as parliament, military command, and even scientific societies.
So Nightingale had to overcome both gender bias and skepticism towards statistics as a policy tool. Even when she had evidence, she still had to persuade the men in power to take it seriously. And one of the ways that she did that was by transforming raw data into persuasive visual mathematics. So, Autumn, tell us, what was groundbreaking about her work in that sense?
So she invented a statistical graphic known as the polar area diagram, also known as a coxcomb chart.
So this to me looks rather like a pie chart, but where some of the slices are not just wider than others, they're also longer. So it looks like a more impressive version of a pie chart.
Instead of presenting tables, she encoded the causes of death geometrically. So anyone could immediately see the dominant role of diseases and how it played into effect. And this was revolutionary because it made more complex data understandable to non experts. It linked quantitative evidence directly to policy decisions, and it demonstrated that statistics can be a tool for social reform. In modern terms, she pioneered data visualization on evidence based policy and applied statistics for public health, decades before those fields formally existed.
So ultimately, whenever a really striking chart goes viral online today, we should think of Florence Nightingale, the woman who realized the power of the mathematical chart to persuade and communicate. But Autumn, I know you have a nerdy little fun fact about her as well. So what is that?
So, Nightingale was the first woman ever elected to the Royal Statistical Society. And even more surprising, she was deeply passionate about mathematics from a young age and argued with her family for permission to study it because they believed that math was inappropriate for women. She once described that statistics as a way to understand God's thoughts, revealing how personally meaningful quantitative reasoning was.
Well, she was a deeply religious woman, wasn't she, who believed that the life into which she was born, that of a middle-class woman, was really lacking in purpose. I mean, she writes in her diaries about feeling that lack of purpose in life and that God had put her on the earth not for marriage and babies, but to instead, through maths, improve the health of soldiers and then more generally, all of us. And did you know that she loved birds? So in her older age, she took great pleasure in feeding the birds in her garden. So, if you forget to think of Florence Nightingale the next time you see a chart go viral, then please instead think of her next time you're in the park watching the birds.
Now, we were taught that Florence Nightingale was just the lady holding the lamp, but she was the woman with the data. She walked hospital corridors at night, yes, but during the day, she built statistical arguments so airtight that military leadership couldn't ignore them. She turned death counts into diagrams and suffering into evidence. And this turned evidence into reform. She didn't just comfort the wounded, she counted them. And maybe that's the part that still matters most. Because every time we measure what others dismiss, every time we insist that numbers tell a moral story, we're standing in her light. And as always, stay curious because you might just change history.